Lyosha and Masha had been married for 8 years. Their marriage, as Alexei said, was based on silly jokes and teenage crushes. When he was 30 and his wife had just turned 27, they had a son. Just recently, the baby turned 3 and went to kindergarten, and Maria finally went to work. During her absence, some things had changed in the company, including the director. The woman met him for the first time and was surprised at what a wonderful person he was. The man's name was Pyotr Alexeyevich, and he was almost 10 years older than Maria. She, fresh out of maternity leave, hungry for socializing with people and for attention from men, was flattered by the fact that the boss was clearly flirting with her. Masha flirted with him, trying not to break boundaries. But it was obvious that Pyotr Alexeyevich was not averse to something more. The flirtation didn't last more than a month. One day, the boss called Maria into his office, closed the door from the inside, and carried out the plan. The woman didn't mind at all, even though she defiantly fought off his touch. After what had happened, every time she saw her boss, Maria's cheeks lit up with embarrassment. She hid her eyes and mumbled during her dialogues with Peter. He was surprisingly strict with her, though whenever he had a chance to pinch or slap her buttocks, he did so. One day, after a working day, when everyone had already left the office, the two lovers were sitting in the study. Pyotr was smoking by the window, and Maria was getting dressed. "Do not be offended that I talk to you so rudely in front of everyone," he suddenly said. Masha was buttoning the buttons on her blouse. She grinned. "I figured as much, conspirator. Gotta get ready. I promised my wife I'd be there on time." The man put out his cigarette and closed the window, even though her husband and child were waiting for her at home. Peter's words about his wife hurt her. She pressed her lips together and silently continued to pack. Frequent delays at work took their toll. Lyosha, who had never been jealous of his beloved, suddenly became nervous. He constantly asked why Maria was late, because this had never happened before. The husband could call several times a day to ask his wife what she was doing at work. The woman was angry at the control that had suddenly descended on her. "Don't call me so much!" she hissed into the phone when Alexei once again decided to make sure his spouse was really at work. "You're embarrassing me!" "I'm just worried," her husband shouted at her. "You should watch your son like that," Maria retorted. Usually after that, irritated Masha hung up the phone and grumbled under her nose for a long time about how dissatisfied she was with Lyosha's behavior. Several times she began to sob right at work when, after a quarrel with her husband, Pyotr Alexeyevich suddenly decided to give her a beating in full view of her colleagues. The woman would choke on her tears of resentment while sitting in the toilet, and the caring employees would take pity on her, not realizing that she had made the whole mess herself. On one such day, Peter asked Maria to stay late after work to finish the reports, but she was so offended by his words from the afternoon that she suddenly refused to do it. The situation was weighing on her. Arguments with her husband, humiliation from her boss in front of everyone, she was tired of it. She wanted to break the vicious circle that brought her more suffering than pleasure. Hearing the rejection, Peter was surprised. He came so close to her that only Masha could hear and whispered, "You have no right to refuse. What are you going to do to me?" Angry tears froze in her eyes. She looked at her boss defiantly, ready to defend her position to the end. But what she heard made the ground fall away from under her feet. "I'll tell your husband everything in detail, how it all happened. And to make him believe me, I'll tell him about the mole in a special place." Peter spoke angrily, but calmly. He was sure of himself and his actions. This argument was stronger than any other that Maria could say to him in reply. "Tonight you will stay," he repeated in a louder voice. Pyotr Alexeyevich left, and the pale Maria remained standing with her mouth open, grasping the edge of the table to keep from falling. Her lover's words pulsed in her ears, keeping her from coming to her senses. A mask of horror froze on her face. Masha waited until the door closed behind the last of her colleagues. When she finally pulled herself together and stood up from her desk, her phone rang. On the screen was her husband's name. The situation couldn't get any sillier. The woman decided not to answer it. In half an hour, she would call him back and lie that she had left the phone in her bag and hadn't heard it. Pyotr Alexeyevich was already waiting for her at his place. Suddenly, the rose-colored glasses fell from Maria's eyes. The man no longer seemed as attractive as before. Now she saw in front of her not the man with whom she was overcome with passion and desire. Now she was looking at a pompous, narcissistic bastard who was threatening her. Peter was smiling contentedly. He was like a cunning fox who had lured another victim into his trap. "What a clever girl," he said, "to have made the right choice. Aren't you afraid I'll tell your wife everything?" In a trembling voice, Masha said. The man laughed. "You think she doesn't know? She's fine with everything. Money, don't you know, turns a blind eye to many problems." Maria had nothing to say. The attempt to threaten her lover as he had threatened her had failed. The woman didn't expect it to work out. At that moment, she didn't know that her phone was still ringing with calls from her husband, and Alexei was already halfway to the place where Masha worked. In his mind, Lesha had already imagined the worst. He saw in colors how he would burst into the office and find his wife there with a man he didn't know. He imagined everything down to the smallest detail, and that made him even angrier. Alexei felt that his wife was deceiving him. Once he noticed a bruise on her shoulder that had almost disappeared, and Masha said she had rubbed it with a gimbag. The man didn't believe a word of it. He told the guard that he had come for his wife and started to climb up. Each step was harder on him than the last. It was as if two heavy weights had been placed on his feet, preventing him from reaching his goal. His heart was pounding against his ribs as if it were about to jump out of his chest. Alexei tried to catch his breath before entering. He held onto the doorknob for a few moments, hesitating to push it open. Finally, when he could control himself, he entered. The lights were on in the corridor and in several other offices. Lyosha looked over to where Maria's desk was. The wife was not at the workplace, but her things were in place, and the phone was on the table. The man listened. The silence was broken by muffled slaps, which came from the far office, where the door was not completely closed. He opened the door with a kick, sharply and without delay. The picture before him made his teeth grind against each other and his fists clench. Maria was sitting on the desk in a pile of papers. A man in a white shirt nestled between her legs. When he heard someone enter, he bounced away from Masha like a scalded man, at the same time trying to pull up his pants. Alexei roared and threw himself at his wife's lover with fists. A fight ensued, which the woman unsuccessfully tried to break up. Finally, she put both arms around her husband's neck and forced him to break away from his rival. Only now, Lyosha looked into his wife's face for the first time. She sat crying, with mascara smudges on her cheeks. The remnants of her lipstick were smeared. Maria looked pathetic. When they got into the car, they both didn't know what to say. Lyosha kept wiping Peter's busted lip with a napkin. At that second, he wanted one thing, for Masha to disappear. He was disgusted to be near her. On the contrary, she wanted to burrow into her husband's arms, to tell him how it was, and for him to understand and forgive her. But no one's wish came true that day. Alexei filed for divorce as soon as he could. Maria begged him not to do it. She sobbed into his phone, promising that everything would change and that it would never happen again. But her husband was as firm as a rock. It was not in his plans to change his mind. The woman had to quit her job. Rumors spread among her colleagues about her relationship with her boss, and he himself was extremely insistent in asking Masha to leave, which she did. The changes that suddenly occurred in her life knocked her out of the glue. She held on as best she could only because she had a son whom Maria could not let down. Often after the divorce, she remembered Alexei. Only when they divorced and he cut off all communication with her did she understand the phrase her mother liked to repeat. What we have, we do not keep, and when we lose it, we cry.